Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining today's webinar on the topic of synthetic data and data simulators. My name is Su Huang. I'm the head of data strategy at Datavant, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. Today, we have guests from Replica Analytics and Novartis joining us. Dr. Khaled El-Imam is the co-founder and CEO of Replica Analytics, a company that is pioneering the approach of creating and using synthetic data. Janice Branson is the global head of advanced methodology and data science and clinical development and analytics at Novartis. She has been with Novartis for 20 years and is part of the leadership team at Novartis for their Data 42 initiative, which is aimed at providing frictionless access to Novartis research and development data. Our webinar today will have two components. First, you'll hear from Khaled about what synthetic data is, how it's generated from real data, and the benefits and drawbacks of using synthetic data. Then you'll hear from Janice on the role that synthetic data can play in pharma R&D and efforts at Novartis's Data 42 program. We will have a panel discussion and then open to audience Q&A. You can submit questions throughout the presentation by using the Q&A icon at the bottom right of your Zoom screen. I'll first turn it over to Khaled.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Sue. And thank you everyone for joining us. In my part of the presentation, I will give you an overview of synthetic data, what it is, how it's generated, and give you some data or some information on the privacy risks and the utility results or fidelity of synthetic data. And my basic thesis in this presentation is that data synthesis or synthetic data generation is the future of data sharing. So let me start off by giving you an overview of some of the primary use cases where synthetic data can be applied. There are two main use cases. The first one is around data sharing and data access. So essentially a privacy use case. And the second one is around data amplification and data augmentation. For data sharing and data access, synthetic data is essentially not real data. It's non-identifiable data or not personal data. And I'll explain to you how that's done in a moment. But because it's not personal information, it can be used and shared and disclosed without obtaining patient consent and with minimal constraints. So the types of applications that would benefit from this are AI and data science projects. We see a lot of organizations that have hired a lot of data scientists to innovate and use data, but they're facing a lot of friction in getting access to these data sets. So synthetic data can address that the problem by providing ready access to these data sets, whether they're internal or external. Software testing is another use case. So instead of using production data for testing software, you can use realistic data that's not identifiable in the form of synthetic data. There are a few other use cases, such as proof of concept and technology evaluations of vendors by giving them synthetic data sets to demonstrate their capabilities. And then, of course, open data and open science and hackathons. Data amplification and data augmentation are also very interesting. And I think some profound applications of synthetic data here, whereby small data sets can be amplified. So if you get access to a small data set with, for example, rare disease or pediatric studies, pediatric patients, you're able to create a larger data set using data synthesis techniques. So you can amplify small data sets. You can also use synthetic data generation methods to correct biases in data sets and to create virtual patients. Virtual patient basically means that if you are, for example, running a clinical study, you can collect data on some patients and then simulate the remaining patients in your study to reach your recruitment targets, for example. These are quite, as I said, profound applications of synthetic data that can have big implications on how clinical research and clinical development in general is conducted. So given these particular use cases, let me explain to you how synthetic data is generated. So you essentially start off with a source data set or a real data set. This would be an identifiable data set of some sort, an EHR data set, claims, clinical trials, pharmacy data, etc. And then you build or you fit a model that captures the patterns and the statistical properties in this source data set. This model is almost always some form of statistical machine learning or deep learning model that captures the main effects, interaction effects in the source data. And then you effectively sample from this model to create the synthetic data. So the synthetic data set is generated from the model. It's not generated from it's not directly derived from the source data. It's sampled from this fitted model. And that's why there is no one-to-one mapping between synthetic records and the source data, or synthetic records and real people, which is why synthetic data is non-identifiable, because you really don't have that one-to-one mapping. But again, I'll show you in a moment. That's a testable hypothesis. You've already seen synthetic data before in the form of deep fakes. So on the top right-hand side here are images of fake people. So these are not real people. These are fake images that were generated from a model that was trained on images of real people. But these pictures are machine-generated pictures. They're not. These people don't actually exist. But you can see that they look quite realistic, and there are very few visible features to demonstrate or to make you think that these are not real people. So the images are quite good, and you can create deep fakes for audio, for videos. There are audios of people giving speeches that they never gave, or videos of Tom Cruise doing stuff that he never did. These are all deep fakes, and they start to look quite realistic. So the technology is good and can be applied for the creation of synthetic structured data, which is really what we're focusing on. So the bottom right-hand side is an example of a synthetic clinical trial data set. So it'll look like real data, and it'll maintain the patterns in the original data set. So one of the questions that typically comes up is, how large does the source data have to be? So in our case, we started our initial projects that we worked on in applying this technology were on clinical trial data. So we developed methods for the synthesis of small data sets. Clinical trial data sets tend to have few patients, a few hundred or a few thousand. So you can scale it down to a few hundred or a few thousand patients and build generative models from that. And then once you've done that, you can generate as many patients as you want. And then the other question that also comes up, this is a basic question, is do you need to know how the synthetic data is going to be used when you're creating the generative models or fitting these models? And the answer is generally no. You don't need to have a precise definition or a precise understanding of the type of analysis that your synthetic data will be used on, because these fitted models capture the patterns in the data quite well. So you can then perform arbitrary analysis on the synthetic data afterwards. And the quality of these models is just improving over time. So taking this idea a little bit further, we can talk about simulator exchanges. So these fitted models, or these generative models can be put in an exchange or a marketplace, and then data consumers can go and search for simulators or generative models. I'm using those two terms interchangeably. So they can search for simulators that have data sets or come from data sets that are interesting for them, or cover cohorts of patients that are interesting for them. And then they can generate as much data as they want from those simulators. It doesn't matter how large the original data set was. Once you built a simulator, then you can generate 100 patients, 1,000 patients, 100,000 patients, 1 million patients. It doesn't matter. You can generate larger data sets from the simulators. So this is a way to essentially democratize access to data sets, in that the data consumers do not access real data, they access simulators. And in most cases, data custodians and data controllers are more comfortable sharing simulators than they are with sharing actual data sets. So it enables rapid access with minimal constraints to realistic data for the data consumers. And these simulator exchanges can be set up internally or externally to an organization. So this becomes kind of a powerful tool to accelerate access to data sets. So I've been making the point that synthetic data is not personal information and can be shared and used and disclosed with minimal constraints. So let's look at some data to demonstrate that. So here's an example of evaluating the privacy risks in synthetic data. This has been published, and at the end of this presentation, there are a number of references for those who want to take a deeper dive. But here are two examples, one from the Washington State Hospital Discharge Database, which is about 650,000 discharges, and then the Canadian COVID-19 data set. This particular one had about 100, just under 100,000 cases. And we created a synthetic version of that data set, and then we measured the privacy risks or the ability to match synthetic records with real people in these data sets. So essentially, identity disclosure risk evaluation. And you can see that compared to a commonly used threshold of 0.09, the risks in synthetic data are quite low by 5 to 10 times, and they're also lower than the privacy risks in the original data set. And this is a pattern that we've seen with many different studies, many different evaluations of synthetic data sets, not just us, but other folks as well who work in this space. The consistent pattern has been that if you do this well, if you create synthetic data well, because you can do it poorly as well, but by overfitting these models. But if you don't do that, then the privacy risks from these synthetic data sets have tended to be quite low. And you can make a credible and quite a good argument that they're no longer identifiable data. But of course, when you manage privacy, you also have an impact on data utility. So there's this privacy utility trade-off. Essentially, if with maximum privacy you have minimal utility, and with maximum utility you have minimal privacy. And therefore, in practice, with any privacy-enhancing technology, you try to find an acceptable trade-off between those two so that you reach your privacy thresholds. As I showed you before, 0.09 is a commonly used threshold, and still maintain the utility of the data. So I've showed you that we can get privacy protective synthetic data, which I think we can talk a little bit later on how this fits in with the HIPAA expert determination method and so on. But privacy protective data. So let's look at the utility impact. So here I'll show you some graphs comparing real and synthetic data sets in different ways. So here's a simple comparison, just two continuous variables, one from the COVID data and one from a clinical trial data set. The first one we're showing the date that a case was reported, and real and synthetic versions of those variables. And you can see that the synthetic continuous variable follows the pattern in the original data relatively well. It's not exact, because if it was exact, then we essentially replicated the original data. So there will be some differences between the real and synthetic data sets, but they're pretty close. They capture the patterns quite well. And this is a complex data set with many variables in it. So it manages to capture the patterns quite well on a variable by variable basis. And then for the BMI variable here, we can see an even closer pattern between the real and the synthetic data sets. And this is quite common in that the synthetic data sets have been able to capture the overall patterns in the original data sets quite well. But this is a simple illustration. We're just looking at a single variable at a time. So let's look at more complex models. So in this example, this is a project we did a short while ago, looking at the modeling mortality from COVID-19 using the Canadian, actually it's Ontario COVID-19 cases. So on this graph, it's again building a machine learning model to predict mortality on real and on synthetic data set. The x-axis is the date since the 1st of January until the end of November, and then the y-axis is the mortality or probability of death from COVID-19. And as you can see, there was the first wave around the March-April timeframe, and then quiet in the summer. As you can see, towards the end of November, the second wave was just about to start. And here we see the estimated probability and the confidence, 95% confidence interval. But the key point here is that this is quite a complex model in the sense that we considered multiple variables, multiple comorbidities, et cetera, in predicting mortality. And this graph shows the mortality factoring out all the other effects And there's quite strong concordance between the real and synthetic data sets. Again, it's not exactly the same because that would be a problem. But the synthetic data set does capture the patterns quite well between compared to the real data set. And here's just another analysis from the same study. Again, COVID-19, looking at mortality with age group. And again, this is a conditional partial dependency plot, which essentially shows the impact of age, factoring out all the other variables. And you can see the predicted probability in the 95% confidence interval and the strong concordance between the real and synthetic data sets. And the numbers at the top are the confidence interval overlaps. So we see this pattern again repeatedly for, in this case, we use gradient boosted decision trees as a machine learning technique to build these models, but we've seen these results, similar results when we have looked at traditional survival models, regression models, etc., traditional epidemiological analysis on a real and synthetic data set. We've been able to get very same conclusions and very similar results between both of them. So the evidence is accumulating that when we do this well, we're able to get high utility data sets that are able to give us the same conclusions as if we had real data. So synthetic data generation technology is improved enough that it's becoming a pretty decent proxy for real data sets, even in complex cases. And we have a bunch of examples with complex EHR data sets, which we can discuss during the panel session afterwards. You'll get this slide deck, bunch of references at the end for if you want to take a deep dive, and then there's our contact information as well if you have any additional questions. And we have a lot of information and knowledge base on our website with high level as well as technical details related to this topic. I'm looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you. And now we'll pass it on to Janice. I will move it to Janice's presentation now. Sorry. There you go. Okay.
Thanks. Thanks, Khaled. Okay, so why is the pharma industry interested in synthetic data? So just to start, these are my thoughts and opinions in this presentation and not necessarily reflecting the views and policies of Novartis. So I would just like to take a step back really and explain what has been the evolution of data sharing and data access in the pharma industry. Then I'll talk a little bit about the challenges we consider in the reuse of clinical data and the possible solutions that we're thinking about. I'll then share a couple of examples of how Novartis is sharing data both externally and also internally for reuse of data. And finally, I'll touch on the potentials of the role of synthetic data. So the evolution of data sharing and access has been going on for at least 13 years. And on the bottom of the timeline, you'll see a lot of the regulatory requests and policies that came into play over this period of time, starting with the FDA ct.gov requests, where we submit basic results of clinical trials. EMA have had various policies and Health Canada, and it continues on with some of these being updated. On the top of the timeline, you see different collaborations that have been set up to really facilitate the sharing of data. So this started in 2011 with the YODA platform, followed quite shortly by clinicalstudydatarequest.com, the second one, and then also Transcelerate is very active in this area and has been sharing a lot of COVID data recently as well. So what has driven this evolution? There's really three factors that play into this. The first one being the reputation of pharma. So in 2013, Ben Goldacre published Bad Pharma, which I think was really focused in trying to bring transparency to what happens in the pharma industry. More and more, we see that key journals request the data as we submit publications, and we're all familiar with the reproducibility crisis in research. Scientific research is another element playing into this. So the development of drugs is long, and we have ever increasing costs. Additionally, companies recognize that they have a lot of internal data. So what can internally we do to reuse these data to help generate more insights, or maybe expedite and decrease the costs of drug development in the future? Technology and data is another key component. Certainly compute power is no longer a barrier. Also, we have a lot of machine learning and AI expertise. And indeed, I think more and more we have interest in many different newer data modalities and bringing these together with clinical data such as omics data, sensors, images, and Internet of Things. So really data has become an asset which has a huge potential in the area of reusing the data to really advance science. However, with this, there are challenges to consider, and I break this down into 4 key buckets: the ethical considerations, legal and data privacy considerations, good scientific research, and business sensitivity. So what are the challenges in these areas? On the ethical side, originally the data in clinical trials, firstly, it's personal sensitive information, and it's collected with an informed consent that the subject has completed, so it should be used in line with the informed consent. Legal and data privacy considerations, we need to adhere to global and national data protection laws, and data privacy laws must be followed. For good scientific research, there's a need for scientifically sound research and reproducible research. And on the business sensitivity side, the primary use of clinical data is, as we know, for the registration of new medicines for patients. So once we move to this reuse of data, we need to take the timing of this into account. So all of these factors really create challenges for us as we think of the reuse of data. And clearly underpinning all of these considerations is a change in mindset, really, both in industry but beyond in how we view data as an asset. So what are some of the possible solutions in these 4 areas? So around the ethical considerations, we can clearly, in some cases, we collect informed consent additionally around reuse of data. So if this has been agreed with patients, then of course we can use it. Another area is use anonymization or generate synthetic data from the original data. On the legal and privacy side, certainly in Europe, GDPR does possibly allow greater flexibility, but what we have is local country-specific interpretations are differing, so it's still quite a challenge on this side. Good scientific research. We hear a lot today about FAIR, so having both data as well as results and methods being findable, accessible, interpretable, and reusable, and the need to really define and follow good data science principles. On the business sensitivity side, I think it's clear that we should focus reuse of data on locked or completed studies. We also need to consider whether the studies have been exploratory in nature or confirmatory or pivotal trials. We need to take into account the stage of the program. So it's quite different if a compound is on the market for 10 years compared to something that's in the process of being approved. And also there's a difference depending on the scientific question of interest and what you're going to use it for. So internally in Novartis, what we're doing to promote data as an asset, at least for externally, as I mentioned, the clinical study data request.com. So a few years after this platform was set up, we became part of this. And so our trials, phase 2 to 4 trials, the anonymized data from these are available for researchers. They submit a proposal. The data is shared in a secure environment, and there's limited access in terms of the time period. And then the researcher has to share the results. And there's more information on the link here. Then internally in Novartis, and Sue mentioned this in my introduction, so I'm part of the leadership team of Data42. This is a project internally in Novartis where we want to facilitate frictionless access to the research and development data. So by that, we really mean making it available to across many of the different departments that are in the data science area. Why do we want to do this? We have a wealth of clinical trial data, and we hope that by more use of this data, it can create efficiencies in drug development programs through using historical data in some trials, new trials, also understanding diseases, and one use case is performing virtual proof of concept studies. Of course, we also have the various challenges when we think about reuse of data internally. So the mindset is that both controllers and data users are really responsible stewards of the data. For good reproducible scientific research, we make sure we're applying principles, we're checking the plausibility of any analysis, the replicability and the strength of evidence that may come out. For fair principles applied, this is to both the data and the results to make sure that other researchers can find what has been done before and reuse it. Ethical and data privacy principles, as I mentioned before, and for the Data42 project, we go into some detail in reviewing informed consent. If we have informed consent for reuse, we can sub-select those patients. Otherwise, we are anonymizing the data for this purpose of reuse. And for data democratization with as open access as possible, here we look into the stage of the trial, the program, the stage, type of the trial, the stage of the program, and the scientific question of interest in order to determine really the governance needed for access. So what is the role of synthetic data? I think it's fair to say that this is a relatively new area for the pharma industry. And on my title slide, you may have noticed that I'm part of the PSI, which is Statisticians in the Pharmaceutical Industry. This is an industry working group. We have a special interest group, the data sharing one, and certainly also there synthetic data is an ongoing discussion. With increased focus on machine learning and artificial intelligence, together with many companies really wanting to be more active in the reuse or secondary use of data, we have to understand how best to balance the risk of re-identification and the data utility, and Khalid mentioned that as well. So current areas where synthetic data is playing a role is in the software and algorithm development and testing, and certainly internally as we develop things like our Shiny apps to explore data, the ideal way would be to have synthetic data to be able to test these tools. Another area is benchmarking of machine learning and AI vendors. Here we provide synthetic data to different vendors and then are able to see what their models might be doing and what they can do. Hackathons and recruiting initiatives are another area of interest, as well as training, and finally for being able to provide open source data. So synthetic data then more specifically in a role in drug development. So there may be many areas to consider, but two potential ones. The first one is synthetic data, the potential of synthetic data as external control arms in randomized control trials. I think the area where this could be a consideration is really around rare diseases, or where there's no standard of care that exists, or the standard of care or placebo, it would be deemed unethical to administer placebo. Or indeed, in a case where the safety profile of a compound is well understood. I would say, however, that currently the gold standard is certainly to use actual external data, real world data, but perhaps there is an option to really explore the potential of replacing the actual real world data or external data with synthetic data. Another area could be in model-informed drug development and in silico trials, and this is an interest area in both EU and US. So in Europe, between 2013 and 15, there was an initiative really in looking into in silico clinical trials. The definition of this was to use individualized computer simulation in the development or regulatory evaluation of products. Similarly, shortly afterwards, the FDA had the Innovation Initiative. This was when Scott Gottlieb was the FDA commissioner, and there's a link here to the article on this. Again, here it was around in silico clinical trials using computer models and simulations to develop and evaluate devices and drugs. Then later on in 2018, the FDA launched the Model-Informed Drug Development Initiative, allowing, it's a pilot program allowing companies to discuss modeling and simulation approaches with the authorities. So to summarize then the regulatory engagement, there's a review from the FDA side from Huang, and the link to the full article is here. They note that the areas of focus so far have been around dose optimization, supportive evidence of efficacy, informing clinical trial design, as well as areas in policy development. They also note that the future areas could be mechanistic models, imaging, and real-world data. I mentioned already the model-informed drug development pilot program, and that will be ongoing until mid-2022. So I think it'll be interesting to see fully how that has been leveraged by then. Then there's also been a survey by HIPAA and pharma on model-informed drug discovery and development. There they indicate that the impact of this is still limited by the acceptance of stakeholders and data availability. For success, they recommend really the cross-functional collaboration of many different areas: pharmacology, quantitative disciplines like statistics, as well as medicine. I think it's also interesting, just to conclude, that the ICH plan to release a draft guidance on model-informed drug development by the end of 2021. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Colette and Janice. That was super interesting. Thanks for providing your perspectives on synthetic data and the pharma industry's use of it. So at this point, we'll move into a panel discussion before opening it up for audience Q&A. So Colette, first a question for you. You know, our audience that Datavant typically works with is very familiar with the expert determination method of de-identifying data. Can you talk about the difference between synthetic data and data that has been de-identified under expert determination?
Sure, yes. I mean, I think this is a very important question. So you can think when synthetic data is used as a privacy enhancing technology, you can think of synthetic data or data synthesis as expert determination on steroids. And by that, I mean that one of the challenges we've had with expert determination, and I've been in this space for almost 17 years and more, is the skill gap. Expert determination requires experts, and there are not many experts and not many places that train those experts. So it's very challenging to find individuals who have the expertise to do the necessary statistical analysis to create de-identified data sets. With synthetic data, the process is largely automated in the sense that you build a model that captures the characteristics of the full data set. So the amount of expertise and effort needed is much lower. So it's scalable and enables you to create more data sets faster that are non-identifiable. So that's one difference. It's really a scalability / expertise skill set advantage in this case. Another consideration is, as we've seen, the privacy risks on synthetic data have tended to be quite low, and comparisons with de-identified data show that it's also lower than for data that has been de-identified using traditional statistical disclosure control methods. But I think the main difference on this point is that with traditional de-identification, you really manage the risk by a combination of modifying the data and implementing controls. It's like security controls, privacy controls, contractual controls, and so on. Because the inherent risks in synthetic data are lower, then you don't need as many controls. So the level of controls needed is lower, which means the economics are also a bit more attractive, because you don't need to invest in as much controls to handle synthetic data as you would with traditionally de-identified data. So those are the main differences, which essentially brings me back to my main point. It's a little bit like expert determination on steroids, because it addresses a number of the challenges faced with expert determination: the scale gap, the scalability issue, and the economics of it. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. There are a couple more, but I'll leave it at that so we can move on to other questions.
Got it. And Datavant's business is focused on privacy preserving data linkage between real world data sets. How does the concept of linkage fit into the picture? Can you link synthetic data sets?
There are ways to link synthetic data sets, but a better approach is to link the original data sets and then create a synthetic data set from the linked data. So that's currently the work that we're doing with Datavant and organizations in the Datavant ecosystem, is to identify data sets that are useful for particular purposes, get those data sets, link them, and then create synthetic versions of those data sets. Once you create the synthetic data sets, you can build the simulators and then simulate larger data sets or larger numbers of patients than the original data that capture the linked data sets, basically the combined patient journey from those data sets.
Yeah, I see. So Datavant tokenization and linking would occur before turning the data set into a synthetic data set.
Yeah, that would be the ideal way of doing it. That's correct.
Yeah, okay. Question for you, Janice. It sounds like a common use of real world data is as external control arms for clinical trials. Do you see synthetic data being used as a control arm in the future?
So in terms of real world data as external controls, I think it's largely we're in the rare disease area, or where it's not ethical to have a placebo arm in the trial. And then we can leverage real world data. And indeed, there are examples of health authority approval of such cases. Moving to the step of synthetic data, I think it's not yet fully established, at least the regulatory pathway, but I think it's certainly something of interest to explore. And I think, when I talked about the model-informed drug development, I think there we have some examples of simulation and models that have helped to, say, predict and actually get approval of a dose that actually maybe has never been studied. Also in terms of extrapolation to pediatric populations and so on. So I think it's an area of discovery and something that should be looked into. Yeah.
Great, awesome. Okay. What about synthetic data generated for longitudinal data? Colette, is that something that you're seeing today?
Yes. So creating synthetic data for simple tabular data is I think, pretty standard right now. It can be done very well. And now the methods have been developed to create synthetic longitudinal data sets. So these would be EHR data sets where patients would have multiple transactions, multiple visits, multiple drugs, multiple diagnoses, multiple procedures, etc. Over time. And there are a couple of white papers we've published, a couple of things on this, where we synthesized EHR data sets, and the results have been good. And these types of data sets, like health system data, longitudinal health system data sets, are quite complex because you have some patients with 10 events and other patients can have tens of thousands of events. So you have quite significant heterogeneity. But with modern data synthesis methods using deep learning techniques, you're able to capture the patterns in these data sets reasonably well and recreate those patterns in synthetic data afterwards. And then the analyses of that data set, of those types of synthetic data sets, have produced results that are similar to the results from the real data. So the evidence that is accumulating around the fidelity of longitudinal synthetic data is increasing, and it's been positive so far. So and the methods to generate those data sets are also improving. It's a very active area of activity and innovation at this point. So it's just getting better over time.
I see. And then one of the things that we hear about at Datavant is that real-world data can be very messy, and there's more and more real-world data sets available now today. How does data synthesis handle the messiness of real-world data? For example, data that may have a lot of missing data fields.
So typically, you're right, real-world data can be quite messy. And going from raw real-world data to curated real-world data is significant effort. But as a general statement, I mean, data synthesis models the original data. So if there's missingness in the original data, then the same amount of missingness and patterns of missingness is reproduced in the synthetic data. So, for example, in some cases, missingness is important. It indicates something, it has meaning. And typically missingness is modeled by these generative models. So then you're able to get the same patterns of missingness in the synthesized data sets. For other types of messiness, such as very, very unusual distributions, or for rare events, data synthesis methods can capture that relatively well. For very, very rare events, any kind of modeling of very rare events is always a challenge. So that part is still a work in progress. But for uncommon events and unusually distributed data, this is no problem. Data synthesis methods can handle that relatively well. But the point is that whatever messiness exists in the original data is replicated in the synthetic data. So synthetic data doesn't clean dirty data; it just reproduces the same patterns of messiness in the synthetic data.
Got it. So moving into a discussion about your predictions for the future, Janice, what do you think about the acceptance of synthetic data by regulators and academics over the next few years? What do you believe is needed to accelerate that?
Good question, Sue. So I think certainly it's a key area of interest in the academic world. I think there's many groups actually looking into synthetic data. I think the acceptance of use of synthetic data, it will depend on the context for the regulators. I think it will be a journey, probably quite a long journey. And what's needed to accelerate it? Well, I think it's probably examples of cases where this has been shown to be useful. And through examples, then I think there will be greater acceptance, but I think it will really depend on the context of where it's used. Yeah.
And what are industry organizations and other groups that you're a part of doing to help with that adoption? Are there efforts to develop guidelines around when synthetic data would be appropriate to be used, for example? What are some of the things that you're seeing from the industry working groups?
So I would say it's fair to say today, at least there's an interest in the discussion on synthetic data, and people are starting to look into where it can be used and what it can be used for. It is very early days. I mentioned I'm part of the special interest group on data transparency or data sharing in PSI, and that there we've started the topic on synthetic data. Normally, what we do when we pick up these topics, we would collect information and then sometimes maybe go in the direction of guidelines, or sometimes just a white paper to try to share more broadly information. It's too early to say yet what will come out of this investigation, but I would say we will try to do something on that and share across the industry.
Great, thank you, Janice. Khaled, anything you want to add to that in terms of your outlook for the future and maybe a perspective on adoption outside of the pharma industry?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think for the privacy use cases, there are some advantages that synthetic data provides or brings to the table. So I think adoption for the privacy use case will progress at a rapid clip, just because synthetic data solves a real problem that exists today. And then on the data augmentation, data simulation use case, or data amplification use case, I think that what we're seeing is there's interest by academic medical centers in data augmentation because they're less constrained by regulatory decisions at this point. So there's interest in data augmentation there to accelerate studies and enable virtual patients to augment real patients recruited in studies. I mean, I agree with Janice that the adoption within the life sciences industry will take time. It'll really be a function of the evidence and the examples and cases that can be brought to bear to demonstrate that this works well. And then when that happens, then I would expect to see adoption to grow faster. But we need that accumulation of evidence for the data augmentation, data amplification use cases. The results I've seen so far are pretty compelling. So I'm optimistic in the sense that just a path we have to go through. It's a series of steps that one has to go through to get there. But we have to take those steps. That needs to happen.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, thank you. We're going to open it up to the audience for their questions. You can submit a question by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom right of your Zoom screen. And we do have a number of questions already in the queue, so I'll go ahead and read them off. First question, how do you address biases that might be amplified during the synthetic data generation off a small data set, such as in the pediatric example that was previously named?
So, I mean, synthetic data doesn't amplify biases. If there are biases in the original data, then the biases will remain in the synthetic data. However, if you know what the biases are, you can correct for them as well. So data synthesis is one technique that can be used to correct biases and to correct imbalances in data sets. But as with any bias correction method, you need to know what biases, or need to discover what biases are in the data, and then you can correct them. So I don't think there's an amplification of bias. There's a replication of bias and potentially a correction of bias that can be achieved through the use of synthetic data.
Okay. Question number 2. Can synthetic data be used for doing research, or all research conclusions need to be replicated on real data from which synthetic data was created?
So I think until recently, there have been more examples of comparisons of folks running analyses on real data and synthetic data and comparing results to see if they get the same results. And the evidence that is accumulated from that has been quite positive, in the sense that the replication of not the quantitative results themselves, but the conclusions has been the same. So be able to replicate the same conclusions. I mean, I'd say over the last year, if you think about the scientific literature, I'd say about half a dozen to 10 different articles over the last year or two with those types of comparisons. Now, what we're starting to see now are studies that are done only on synthetic data, where there is no comparison with real data. So, here's a synthetic data set, and here are the results from the synthetic data set. And these are now being published in scientific journals, which is a very interesting trend. And what we're also seeing is IRBs waiving reviews for clinical studies that use synthetic data because they don't consider it to be human subjects research because it's not real patient data, which again is a very interesting trend in that there's a definite advantage here if you're able to skip the IRB review step for studies being conducted with synthetic data. It just accelerates your ability to start and conclude studies faster, get them done quicker. So these are interesting trends that we're starting to see. The other point I'll make is, I mean, again, as I mentioned, I've been doing this for many years, and when we started with de-identification, 15 years ago or so, it was the same thing. People were saying, well, I don't want to do studies on de-identified data. I only want the real data. And there was this question mark about, can we trust de-identified data and so on. And as the evidence accumulated that you get more or less the same results with properly de-identified data as with real data, now people don't ask the question. You have de-identified data, you do the analysis, you get the results, and you rely on those results for decision making and use the models in practice. And I think synthetic data will go through the same process. It's just that the pace of innovation is much faster now. So, my hypothesis is that the rate at which this will happen will be quicker now compared to the rate that this happened with the previous cycle with kind of expert determination / statistical disclosure control methods, where it did take some time for acceptance of de-identified data as a proxy or in lieu of real data sets.
Okay. Another question in the queue. Is it ethical and legal in certain contexts to augment small data sets with synthetic data? The point of larger population sizes is to capture as many scenarios as possible to ensure safety broadly. Does the use of synthetic data potentially amplify the population you already had for the purpose of having a larger N versus an actual broadening of the study population?
Yeah, I mean, what we've seen in practice is that, and this is not all the time in it's not 100%, but in enough cases, a large enough majority that, so let's say, for example, an observational study where you're recruiting patients for a particular type of analysis. So, one we did recently was looking at oncology patients, looking at toxicities from their treatment. And what we found is if you take the first, say, 80% of the patients that participated in the study and then simulate the remaining 20% with respect to your planned recruitment target, the conclusions are the same. You didn't need to actually recruit and wait for the last 20%. You could have used the 80%, simulate the remaining 20% virtual patients. So then you have the hybrid 80-20 data set, and then you do your analysis on that, and you were getting the same results. This works when the first 80% are representative. So the heterogeneity in the data is captured by the first 80% of the patients. And the additional 20% are essentially giving you a bigger N rather than increasing the heterogeneity in the data. So then you build a generative model, which you can argue is a model of the population, and then you use that population model to sample or generate additional virtual patients to add to your data set. So we've done that with a number of oncology studies, and the results are the same in that the analysis conclusions from the hybrid data sets are the same as for the complete 100% real patient data set. But this works when the initial patients are representative. If, for example, you're doing a study and you change your protocol midway, then there will be a difference between early and late participants. But when there's no fundamental change in the protocol over time, then the early participants capture the patterns, capture the heterogeneity in the group that you're studying or you're collecting data on, and we're able to get pretty good models from that. And the machine learning models they're used to build these generative models are really good at capturing subtle patterns. So so it has worked. Empirically, we observed that this has worked reasonably well so far, and have produced reliable results. Again, early days, these are the formative stages of this whole area, but the results so far have been quite encouraging. It raises another interesting question about, if you do this and you're able to simulate as many virtual patients as you want, what does the concept of statistical significance apply anymore? Because they can simulate a much larger virtual patient cohort, and then everything is statistically significant. So you really just focus on the effect sizes and whether treatments work or not, but really reducing the importance or reliance on statistical significance as a means to evaluate the validity of the results. Because you can just simulate more and more patients. You can make it as big as you want effectively. So that's an interesting hypothesis or direction to take as well, to evaluate using simulation and these kind of simulation techniques to enhance and augment clinical research and potentially to accelerate it as well.
Hello, I guess, Khaled, just add, I guess it's not, the regulatory pathway is not yet established there, yeah? So that's going to take some time.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then another question, similar question around the idea of using synthetic data to augment a relatively small data set. The question is around how this concept applies to linked data sets where there might be many different types of data linked together, and maybe broadly, Khaled, you can talk about whether there's a limit to the amount of synthetic data that can be generated.
Well, once you've created a generative model, then you can generate from it as much data as you want. So you essentially build a model and then you're sampling from it. So so in that sense, I mean, within reason, of course, but you can generate more data than the original data set that was used to create the generative model. And that's really one of the main advantages of creating generative models or creating simulators. Whether it's linked data or not is, I guess maybe the other side of this question is the number of variables. As you link more and more data sets, you have more and more variables. So is there a limit in terms of the number of variables? I'm sure there is a limit, but so far on real data sets, generative models have been created on data sets with hundreds or thousands of variables, and it's worked reasonably well. So at least it scales to that level. And this is reflective of some quite complex data sets. So that has worked well. Can it go beyond that? I don't know. I haven't seen examples, but for complex AHR data sets, the synthesis has produced data sets where the analysis results between real and synthetic data sets have been quite similar.
Mm-hmm. Got it. And then one last question from the question queue. Can we create synthetic data from identified data? And can creating synthetic data be a way of doing de-identification?
Yes, absolutely. That's one of the kind of basic use cases for synthetic data generation, is to take identified data as input, build these generative models, and then create de-identified or non-identifiable data sets from these models.
Great, awesome. And I think we will close out our Q&A session at this time. Thank you so much to our guests, Khaled and Janice, for joining this webinar and presenting on such a cutting edge topic. For all the audience members, thank you for your interest and your questions. We will send out the recording of this webinar later this week, and I hope everybody has a great day and a great upcoming 4th of July holiday. Thank you so much for joining.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye.